cyber security panel tomorrow morning. So here we are. But cybersecurity is a pretty interesting thing, and I think that I would introduce the topic to the fact that this cybersecurity is just not people hacking your device. It's things that happen every day in your life. And so last February, I was at the RSA Cybersecurity Conference in San Francisco, and it was actually the last big conference that was held before the pandemic pretty much shut everything down. And so I had asked to be registered as is right here, Gary Saka at CAI, where I've been a board member of this container leasing company for the last 14 years. But for some reason, they had transposed the letters, and so I was Gary Saka at CIA. So one of the things that happened to me was that I am a board member of a company here, Digital Solid State Propulsion, that does a lot of work in the national defense area and for the Army and the Air Force and NASA. So it wasn't more than a few minutes at one of the receptions that suddenly I had two Chinese ladies who came up to me. Maybe Eric Swalwell wasn't there, and started chatting me up. And they had already looked up my LinkedIn profile and wanted to connect. So fortunately, I had a person there that said, "Gary, get out of here. That's I have a guy that can spot spies everywhere." And he had worked in Monterey, the Defense Department there. And so we got him away. But that, security, I think, is everywhere. And so they said that in Silicon Valley, if you don't find a half a dozen people that are, spies that if you kind of going around your normal neighborhood and stuff, in terms of the conferences or lunches, dinners, they're everywhere. So, I think that what I'd like to see is that when we talk about strict cyber, also I'd like to see about your companies in terms of the old World War II situation where loose lips sink ships. So first of all, I think I'm going to get Gregory. The only reason I'm going to talk to Gregory is I have a son named Gregory and I know how to pronounce that name. So why don't we go ahead and introduce ourselves for a couple minutes, and then we'll go ahead and talk about the questions.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we hear you loud and clear.
Perfect. So my name is Greg Pepus. I'm the Chief Solutions Architect at FUTURA Cyber and founder of that company. We are focused in the heart of cybersecurity, not probably in the mainstream in terms of what people sitting in the audience will identify with, if from a consumer perspective, but from a corporate and government policy and procedure, as well as implementation of protective processes. We're very involved with encryption key management, public key infrastructure, cryptography in a range of areas. And all of that is intended to do everything from protecting data on the wire to protecting data at rest that's stored on your hard disk drives, to points in between. And I think one of the things that I think a lot of people don't appreciate is, we live in a world where everything has computer chips in it. Everything's a computer. And it really is important that you take into consideration that cybersecurity needs to affect everything. And it's not just your desktop or your server or your network, but I mean, it could be your thermometer in your house. It could be a motor controller inside a big diesel engine on a ship. It could be the electronic device that sits on a container that regulates secure access to the container on a container ship. So, I mean, cybersecurity is everywhere. And so we're really involved both at a policy level and at a technology level with trying to bring cybersecurity into the forefront. Hope that's helpful.
Okay, that's a good one. Now, I'm not going to mispronounce your first name. And Mr.
Yeah,
Suri.
right,
My
it's
my
Saurabh.
last names get mispronounced a lot, so why don't you say it a couple of times so people in the audience will hear how it's pronounced?
Sure. My name's Saurabh Suri. I'm the managing partner at Cerra Ventures, where we invest primarily in three areas of technology. So that's cybersecurity, enterprise AI, and healthcare. And we really consider these three areas as what we call the new fundamentals of the digital age. You know, your original fundamentals being food, shelter, clothing, etc. So my background's actually in pure tech and AI research, but about a decade ago, I kind of made the switch from, you know, what I call the technology business to the business of technology. And I've been investing in startups ever since. My background also as an entrepreneur in both IT services as well as IT product and product development, having done quite a bit of work both in Israel as well as the US. And at Cerra right now, we've got a significant cyber portfolio, which is almost intended to double, if not triple, just within the next 6 to 8 months.
Okay, so that's a good thing. I think before we get into the specific questions that I got from Marty here, you know, one of the things that just happened recently, and maybe I'm tying it into gaming, the Chinese Communist Party has basically said they're going to limit teenagers or kids or whenever they start playing gaming games to 3 hours a week. 3 hours a week. Now, when I mentioned that to one of my sons, I said 3 hours a day. And he said, "Boy, that's kind of rough," but it's actually 3 hours a week. And so the idea behind that is that they're getting so involved in these games, and you know, I don't want to badmouth the excellent presentation on the gaming, but that they're getting so involved in this that they're not really looking at the real world. They want people to, you know, okay, there's probably some gamers that are going to be operating drones, but the whole thing of national security is not just drones, it's technical education and science, and it's probably a lot of propaganda in terms of political messages that they have there. So what do you, in terms of the evolution, do you see, you know, we have to compete against them, and so, you know, when I graduated from high school in the 6th grade, Sputnik went out. By the 7th grade, we had this terrific math and science education, and we're always in an accelerated program. But today, I think there's less than half the amount of people outside, you know, immigrants coming to this country that are majoring in those hard sciences. So first of all, from a cybersecurity point of view, you see that we will have in our country enough people, or at least coming in, that will be able to handle these jobs that are there, both you know, cyber and also, you know, building the software systems within the companies. So I think I'll start with Greg, and you know, we'll go.
Okay. So we have protracted discussions on the fact that right now there's as many as 600,000 open positions for cybersecurity in the United States, minimal. And if you look at Europe, South America, it's probably close to 2 million, you know, reaching across the globe. The United States has solved some of the education problem in other areas, particularly medicine. I mean, there was a real critical shortage, and there still is to a degree, but it's getting better, of medicine and nursing. The same kinds of programs and intent and focus needs to be brought forward both at the federal and state level to start training people in cybersecurity. And just to put some things to sleep, you don't need a college degree to do it. What you need is training in the particular areas that we need help in. So it's gonna, you know, since I was working, you know, in the government 20 years ago, this has been a topic of discussion that, you know, we're very concerned the Chinese are graduating over 1 million people a year into the cybersecurity field, and that doesn't count other parts of software engineering and whatnot. And so, we have, and that's just the Chinese. You start looking at, North Korea, what they're doing in Iran and other adversaries that we're facing. Those guys are really focused, and we really have to step up. And I think that one of the great equalizers will be technology. I think, the innovation that Saurabh is working on, and people like myself are working on, are a multiplier and do make individuals more effective, but we still need numbers. There's still a great demand for people. And, everybody's worried about, oh, AI is going to put me out of a job. And, for every job that's lost, there's probably 5 to 10 jobs that we could fund and support and get behind with the appropriate economic incentives. So anyway, over to you, sir.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Greg, one thing I'll add to that, because I think you made a very important nuanced point, right? Which is just training people in STEM, science, technology, engineering, math, does not mean that they're cyber ready, right?
Right.
It's a very different discipline. There is a huge shortage. And it's also very interesting to see how other countries are trying to overcome this gap. You mentioned about the Chinese and the 1 million people just in the cybersecurity discipline. You see what's happening in Russia, and it's fascinating on how Russia deals with its, what they call the black hat hackers, right? The people, the Russian hacking other people, ransomware, et cetera, where the Russian government essentially says, we don't care what you're doing outside of Russia. You just have 2 rules. Number 1, don't do it inside of Russia. And number 2, when we call you, drop everything and you work for us. And if you look at the cyber attack on Ukraine, again, allegedly, there is the massive thing that it was these same bad actors who suddenly became state actors in hacking of Ukraine. Yep. Right. So different countries are dealing with this in different ways, but essentially, number 1, yeah, there is a huge skill gap. You're talking about the 600,000 open positions just in the US alone, but those are the open positions. Required is a larger number. Right now, we're nowhere close to filling that.
It's almost like we need a Manhattan Project. I mean, just to get the skill sets up. And I mean, to a lesser extent, or maybe equal, we need science and engineering and technology, medicine and mathematics. I mean, we need those things. And, US kids, second generation people growing up here, they're not focusing in that in high school. And there really needs to be a lot more emphasis and encouragement to get people into those fields. And it just has to be done. We need something like the space program to really get people sexed up, jazzed up,
Okay, so that sounded like a really good situation. The question is, are the kids so involved in games? Because to some extent, I think you're talking about this whole cyber hacking and stuff is almost like a game. Many years ago, I would have the IT departments, and those guys would probably go get a pizza and go home. Hopefully a few of them at least went to a bar and were able to meet some women and get married, but nobody went out and decided to rob a bank or go out and steal pizza or whatever. But today you see kids go home and they can hack in and go into things and it doesn't seem like it's a crime. So and so when I talked to the first secretary of HHS, he ended up, I mentioned that, and he said, that's funny because my daughter lost her credit card, and there was on a theft of that, and she said, so what? It's just I'm covered. I don't have any exposure. Maybe she had $50, but $50 was a lot of money to him. So it seems like from a criminal standpoint that the judges and the legislatures don't put enough penalties on cyber crime. And first of all, they got to catch them. But I mean, but there's certain crimes you can, you do get prosecuted. Not wearing a mask in California inside, but on the other hand, you don't get prosecuted on a lot of crimes of
Gary,
of hacking.
how can you even if you catch the guy, how can you prove it?
Yeah, I mean,
It's all
this is the problem. You're talking about what a lot of judges and legal people think of as victimless crimes, because it's abstruse as to who got hurt, right? If somebody hacks into an account in the bank, yeah, maybe the account holder got hurt, but overall the bank got hurt. That's a little bit easier, but a lot of times it's much more diffuse in terms of, who gets injured, and it's harder to prove as well. So, and I just think there's a lack of understanding across the board about a lot of these issues as well. People just don't understand the issues, legal included.
Yeah. Any other comments, Saurabh? Okay, Gregory?
Saurabh, you're muted.
Right.
There's always one guy who does that, isn't there? No, but essentially the two aspects to this. One is the regulation, and the second is the enforcement of the regulation, right? If I may use a loose analogy, it's like getting your pocket picked in the subways in New York in the 80s or the 90s, right? There wasn't that strict regulation. There wasn't that much of implementation. Of course, this is way more complex, way bigger and crazier for sure. But the good news, what we see is regulation has started to come up a little bit, but the enforcement of that regulation is still really far, far behind. And I think that's the critical piece, because right now, enforcement or even catching the criminals, especially when it comes to, a corporate gets hacked, is actually left up to the corporate and who they hire to figure out who it is, rather than, a central system doing it. And I think to a large extent, that's pretty much related to your first question, Guy, which is, the huge shortage of people to actually understand and do it.
So I think I was at one panel, I'm not sure where it was now, but they talked about the fact that one of the problems with companies is they don't want to admit they've been hacked. And so there needs, and they oftentimes won't share that information with the government, so they can, in some manner that they can kind of coordinate and see where all the attacks are coming from. And so as a result, they don't want to be embarrassed. They oftentimes will pay Bitcoin or Ethereum or whatever's in the thing, or maybe iTunes cards if it's a smaller hack. So what happens there? What do you think we can do to encourage the fact that there's some sort of central reporting agency that we would go on?
Well, I mean, for me, I would actually say a lot of that has to be regulated. And right now, CISA is one of the organizations at the federal government level that's really got to take charge of that. The FBI is another, but let's take, for example, the Colonial Pipeline hack. They didn't report, I want to say it took them a week or more to even report the fact that they were getting hacked to any relevant authority, so that they could actually notify other target organizations that might get injured by the same sort of issue. And that's because there's not enough regulation in there to support security. And so, again, it goes to understanding, people in the companies, the Colonial Pipeline, they take a look at it and they say, well, this is a big PR problem for us. Aside from the fact that they couldn't get in their accounting system, but, which is worse. And then they panic about the PR, and instead of doing the right thing, which they don't know quite what to do, they end up doing the wrong thing, and it just delays the inevitable. So, and as anybody who watched the process, once the right people were involved in the government with Colonial Pipeline, they actually got a lot of the money, ransom money, that was paid back. So it's, the thing is, so it's an education process for government and corporate and other partners to understand, who to talk to, how to talk to them. And that's where CISA, which is a DHS organization, the cybersecurity infrastructure agency, that they are starting to make, a lot more inroads with commercial entities, as well as other state and local government to really get a handle on these things. But it's just going to take time, and you're going to see more attacks. It's like anything. If there's stop signs at an intersection, they won't put a traffic light until somebody gets hurt. It's the same kind of thing. Enough people got to get hurt, and unfortunately, that's just the way things seem to go. But there are ways around it. But people don't always go there first.
Yeah,
I'd like
and
to talk more about that.
yeah, and it's an interesting aspect when you, especially when you talk about, that most people don't even report a data breach. Yes, I mean, now recently, not reporting a data breach, especially when consumers are involved, is an offense.
Correct.
However, when you look at it from a company's perspective, it's cheaper for them to just pay off the hackers and not report it. Because if they report it, the impact to market value, reputation, et cetera, is
Correct.
much larger. One of the ways they're trying to change it, and we work with a lot of companies that do cyber insurance, right? So it's this almost tri-party effect of government and regulation, cyber risk and cyber insurance companies, and the organizations, and a bit of change in regulation to actually make reporting better, to make people definitely more accountable, but also more safe. So that's where we see where it's going. But Greg, I agree with you. That's something that'll still take a little bit of time, and let's call it the Greg's traffic light problem there. But yeah.
I mean, and I would segue from there. Gary, why are these companies getting in trouble in the first place? And I'm also in a venture-oriented organization aside from my day job, and one of the things we're discussing is, how do you get companies and even government agencies, by the way, to make the investment to do the bare minimum that prevents them from being in the situation that SolarWinds and Colonial Pipeline and others found themselves in. And the problem is, from a corporate perspective, people always say no at the C ring, and what they really need to do is be told is if you spend $200K here, you prevent spending 2 million or 10 million down the road. And if you do all the right cybersecurity things now, and you bring in an expert to do the audits and tell you what you need to invest in, now you prevent a lot of the crap that people found themselves going through with Colonial Pipeline. And
yeah, and that's where I'll see and ask people about an ROI on software investment, which is really something that you can measure if you're putting in a new system, and you can either save people or do tasks on a faster basis, or get more analytics. But one of the questions is the evolution of the current threat landscape. And so I thought I'd start off by saying, and then you can continue, is that here we are in Palo Alto. They have a Palo Alto Daily News that's published every day. And before the pandemic, you'd always find, oh, some guy got his computer stolen because he went to someplace and they grabbed all the HR records and left it in the car and they stole it out of the car. But now with all of these people working from home, and some of them maybe forever working from home, do you think the current, so the evolution of the current threat landscape, you can go and I can go on and, somebody can get in my computer from the office and they can, see everything on my computer. So the question is this now, this whole pandemic and the work from home, making it either even harder for companies, as opposed to having a sort of a locked up data center that people had to go into a sort of a clean room to go and look at?
yes.
But is that there really people, because I guess it's the permissions. Who do you let see things and where do you let them see them? And I've got a dozen brokerage accounts, and part of the some at the same place, but others are the Roth and the IRA and the just the joint account and so on. But the question is, if somebody gets into one of those, and I see people doing streaming quotes downtown or other things like that, I see people doing a lot of work downtown where I live, and though most of the guys are startups, so they don't have any money anyways, but there are some people that are really doing corporate work that they could get hacked in. So what would you suggest in that respect, that the policies there? Go ahead.
Saurabh, you want to?
Sure. You actually mentioned a whole bunch of things in that one, Gary. So, first looking at the threat landscape, okay? When we look at threat landscapes, there's another jargon word that I'm going to use, which is oft thrown around, especially in the investing space, and that's called an attack vector, What's an attack vector, right? It's essentially a method of gaining access to a network or a computer system, or more specifically, gaining unauthorized access. So hacking your phone, your account, your whatever, right? You look at it about a decade ago, and Greg's way deeper on this than I am, but a decade ago, you talk about maybe 8 or 10 attack vectors. Today, we're talking about 70 plus attack vectors with the technologies changing, et cetera, right? The second aspect of what you talked about is more of the solution stack, right? So in terms of how does a person protect? Now, it's obviously different of whether you're as an individual, whether you're a startup, or whether you're a large enterprise. But the one thing we look at, especially when we look at from the investing side of the world, we look at what we call layering, right? So cybersecurity or securing yourself, your startup, or your enterprise is not about one solution. Hey, I installed X, Y, and Z malware app. I'm safe. Thank you very much. No, it's layers. Think of it as moats. In the erstwhile castles, where you had 6, 7 layers off of it, right? And of course,
classically a web of trust.
I like that. Yeah, more like a web of trust. So as an individual, the one thing we tell everybody, use what they call multi-factor authentication, right? If you're a startup, add endpoint detection or network security or cloud security to that. If you're an enterprise, add layers upon layers on it, right? And those layers are important. Why? Because the attack vectors are constantly changing and constantly evolving, right? And that's the criticality of it. And that's what you also see the reason why, cybersecurity spends in themselves have increased astronomically. And so has cybersecurity impact, right? I still remember reading an interesting report. I think it was Pew Research that said, the impact of malware by 2021 will be almost, what was it, $500 million. That's a joke right now. Right? By last estimates, it was about 3 trillion, moving up to 6 trillion. So you see that, and as you said, the COVID pandemic, the work from home, all of that's been a huge aspect of it.
I would just, that's, really underpinned by the fact that cybersecurity is not impossible. I won't say it's easy. Because you got all these attack vectors, and we have so many more attack surfaces, meaning target devices and interfaces and ways to get hacked. So the thing is, the government, if you look at the portions of the government, the FBI and the intelligence community and DoD, who operate in very kind of severe threat environments, protecting their systems, it's not impossible. And in fact, nowadays, if you want to do government work on, government contracts that are even remotely sensitive, there's a new standard coming out that you have to basically do an audit of your enterprise. You have to put the same government controls from the National Institute of Standards. These are called the 800 standards. There's 800-53, which are all the basic things like, have you locked your external drives? Have you turned on encryption? When people log off their laptop, does the hard disk separately get encrypted? Is the network encrypted? Are you using certificates? I mean, there's a million different questions in there, but the bottom line is these are all things you can have a checklist and you can go through and check them off in your enterprise. And frankly, your cybersecurity people there should be doing that if they're not already. And in fact, to do business with the government, you have to do these things. So it's not insurmountable, but it's a lack of knowledge. I find 7 out of 10 at the C-ring level, people don't know what to do. The CEO, CTO, CFO, even the CIO, they know generally they have to protect their enterprise, but they don't know what to do, how to do it, how to go about it. There's lots of expertise out there.
Do you think it's become so complex now that a company, unless it's a really large company, can't do it themselves, and therefore they need to bring in a consultant, maybe trying to do a hacking on them or going to do a review every year or something like that? Do you think that's a necessity and a job that some people are
I think
specific.
people would find that money very well spent, Gary. I think it's not unreasonable for a moderately sized company, let's say between $2 and $5 million in revenue a year, to spend $40,000 to $100,000, part of which would be an audit and review, and then to make an investment in certain cybersecurity protection assets, software, technology, training. Training is a big part of this. I mean, even down to the people who just sit at their desk and do their information processing job. If they don't know what the art of the possible is or how they can get hacked, or if they click that link that they really shouldn't have clicked in their, in their email or their text messaging or in their messenger from Facebook, if they don't know these things, they can't, protect against them. Whereas a little training, a little investment, and a little standard oversight, you can do a lot. I mean, I would venture to say solar winds, maybe not, because that was a really sophisticated thing, but something like the Colonial Pipeline, they could have prevented that. That was completely, in my opinion, a self-inflicted wound in that environment. Because
and so it's a lot cheaper to kind of do these things, especially with the fishing. Many years ago when I was in the ship chartering business in New York, I'd get a very nicely written letter from some poor Nigerian or Liberian or whatever whose father had died. He was a government official, and he had squirreled away a few $1 million, and he was willing to share it with me if I'd give him my bank details. But now, of course, I don't know how many guys this Africa would probably be the most productive country in the world if they ever found all that money. But so now today you get a lot of fishing and stuff. Well, if we look at, I'm not sure how long Marty's going to give us, but if we look at the biggest trends that will describe the cybersecurity over the next 5 years, if you guys were consultants to major companies or even companies that are only a few $1 million in revenue, what would you say they've got to be looking for? How would they staff, and what should they protect?
Right. So I can talk, when you talk about cybersecurity trends in itself, right? So one is cybersecurity trends from an enterprise perspective. What should they look at? What do they, what should they protect? And then you look at the overall cybersecurity trends from an investing perspective, which kind of align the two, right? So at least from the investing side of the world, the three big ones that we see, one is around users and usability. Okay, and Gary, I'll go back to something you mentioned, which is this getting too complex? And what we're seeing, at least the next trends coming in terms of the big companies, are technologies that are trying to enhance protection, but reduce complexity and friction. Simplest example of this, the technologies out there going towards passwordless. Okay, we all know problems with passwords, remembering them, using them, And you see some of the biggest companies coming out are companies in the passwordless domain. That's just an example, but that's the first trend, users and usability.
And that's like I have voice authentication, although I'm sure there's some people with this, that they can do a voice pattern. They'll say, hey, you got to talk a little longer, Gary.
Exactly. You got voice, you got, that comes under what they call biometric. You got your fingerprint, you got retina and iris. Which is a huge push. Face, everybody uses their iPhone, etc. So yeah, that's a huge area of increase. The second, at least the way we see it, is around data. And we break out data into data security and data compliance, right? So data security, how do I protect my data? When you go in now, you use AI tagging, you go and you move from detection to prevention to almost pervasive detection and prevention. You got enterprises that are desperately trying to move into real-time data visibility, which is one of the biggest areas, right? There's a huge amount of not just investment, but focus, buying, etc., going on that data space. And then there's data compliance. Governments are coming up with all of this stuff. GDPR is just the first salvo in data compliance. That's getting huge. And the last one, my favorite one, and probably the craziest one, is on critical infrastructure, right? We keep saying Colonial Pipeline, and I did see Greg smile on that, because interestingly, Colonial Pipeline was not a critical infrastructure attack. Let me explain. They did not attack the pipeline.
Correct.
They attacked the business at the back that was running. They attacked the finance guys there.
Yeah, they
Now,
lock the accounting system.
exactly. They locked the accounting system. Okay. But having said that, if you look at it, if you look at the state of Estonia, which was crippled with a critical infrastructure attack, Ukraine, which was again crippled. Across the board, that's an issue. But I know we're almost out of time, so I'll just stop there. Say those are the three areas we look at.
We have questions from the audience? Any questions?
Yeah,
Yeah, so, I mean, a lot of excellent points made. And so I guess one general question is, we are a small business, right? I worked in the corporate world in semiconductors, and we're a huge, big company that still got hacked and so on. So if I'm a real small company starting out, and let's say we're in the real estate, sector, we have, databases of, our investors and, some other critical information, and we are a company of, say, I don't know, 20 employees, right? What suggestion would you have, right? As every computer has to be updated to the latest patch, and I mean, there's so many, and a lot of things are on the cloud and so on, right? How do I make sure I don't know, it's as secure as possible, and if at all I get attacked, I even know that I'm being attacked, right? I not even know. So for a small company like us, how do you have any best practices in terms of, how do we secure and continue to keep, things secure?
so you're talking about something that you're online, because remember the Boston baked beans commercial where the guy says, I've got my secret formula for these spicy beans and stuff, and nobody's going to get it. And he takes the piece of paper and chews it up. So I guess if you're offline, you can put some things in a secure place, but those are just some books and records or something like that.
Yeah, no,
Yeah, so this is really when almost everybody has to be online and connected, but you can also have a computer that all you do is, Excel spreadsheets or other kinds of things like that, and it's not online. Maybe a separate computer that does. So
yeah, no, what I'm saying,
Yeah.
I get your structure. Let's say that there's 20 employees, right? But all the
Yeah.
data is in the cloud. A lot of people are working from home and so on.
Yeah,
You almost, you don't have a choice when you want, the whole team to access, it has to be
yeah,
on the cloud.
Yeah.
Different thing is that dual authentication. I mean, I'm just wondering, right? Like they're saying it's a highly, dynamic, evolving issue.
Yeah.
So any best practices you guys would suggest for small businesses?
yeah. Go ahead, guys.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I would say, and this is more specific, but anywhere that you can implement encryption, I would implement encryption. So if you can issue certificates, if you can implement encryption, these will be things that your security people will tell you how to do, but I would do it. The second thing is your security people, if you have them, or your outside consultants, most of the systems on the IT side that are coming with security features. The big problem is people don't know how to use them. And so, when you bring a new technology in, make sure you understand the security features and whether it has the security features that you're looking for. And you should really understand that before making any acquisitions. And I think the long-term, the long-term impact of that is things like machine learning are going to make it easier to turn those features on and off, and to make sure they're turned on and off across the board, more generalized, as well as specific to a particular thing like an accounting system, for example. Anyway.
How about just personal use of business computers? Like I'd always bring in my own laptop if I wanted to do anything on a personal basis, including my streaming quotes or whatever. Do you think that it would be beneficial if people don't use the business computer for personal things?
Yeah, I mean, I would recommend VDI. Saurabh, you might want to weigh in on that, but VDIs can be completely locked down. Those are virtual desktops in the cloud, and that's controlled by the corporate entity. I would never use somebody's personal laptop for business.
Yeah, we live in the world of BYOD, right? Bring your own device, right? So the only way to offset that, and I love the way Greg puts it, is it's the virtual aspect is the only thing you can really use to control it. So VDI is right now the de facto solution to control that for sure.
Someone is at the
I have a question from the audience.
Yeah,
What portion of the cybersecurity market is already represented in public markets?
A very small portion. If you look at overall public markets and you see take the technology market overall has a decent size representation on it. Whether you talk about the Nasdaq, S&P 500, whatever. But when you talk about the cybersecurity market, it's a very, very small sliver. In fact, if you look at it, the latest trend really on that is small cap companies going public. What used to be derided as the penny stock exchanges and things like that earlier, that's happening. But from an overall perspective, it's massively underrepresented right now.
Yeah, I'd agree.
Are there any cybersecurity unicorns or decacorns?
Lots of them. Yeah.
Of course.
Of course.
I'm saying, can you name a few?
Sure. There's FireEye. There's CrowdStrike.
Tenable
Tenable.
is already public, but they're I think yeah. I mean, there's probably.
And we're not even talking about the old world. We're not talking about the McAfees and the Nortons, etc. of the world at all. We're talking about new age.
Yeah.